Thanks for joining this webinar. My name is Natalie from Orchid, and today Anne and I will go through tips for using Info Explorer. While artificial intelligence seems to be a very contemporary buzzword, gathering and using intelligence to be more competitive is not a new idea. In last month's article, David presented a brief history of business intelligence and shared some insight into different definitions of BI. And I encourage you to have a look at the Info Explorer website for the article. Today, we will share some tips on how Info Explorer can help your business be more competitive by helping you analyze your data in a flexible manner, identifying exceptions, identify trends and opportunities, and turn those into actions. Briefly, for those of you who are new to Orchid, who are we and what do we do? We have been in business for over 30 years, have won many awards over the years. We're based in Sydney, Australia. And we work with business partners in the Sage world, the Spy world, and other ERP-related application in over 80 countries, and currently support over 7,000 sites around the world. Specifically in the business intelligence world, we have been working with business intelligence pretty much since the beginning with various BI tools applied to a range of ERP applications. So we've been working with Crystal Reports, with TM1, which is now part of IBM Cognos, with Brio Query, and Info Explorer has been around for many years, working with a range of ERP systems in the Sage world, Sage 300, Sage X3, Sage CRM, Microsoft Dynamics, SAP B1, Odoo, and more recently Spire. In today's presentation, we will use examples using Sage 300 and Spire, but the majority of the tips we'll share apply to Info Explorer used with any ODBC databases. We are often asked questions on how to try and use Info Explorer to look like an existing spreadsheet or a Crystal report. And while this is generally possible, the main benefit of Info Explorer is that you can create new views in the data on the fly. You don't just rely on the information provided to you in a static report. So the focus today will be on tips to use the application to make the cubes more dynamic and easier to use in a flexible manner. So you won't have to wait for up-to-date data to answer your urgent questions or get frustrated by using reports that don't give you the right detail. So Info Explorer is designed to analyze your data across multiple dimensions, such as fiscal year or fiscal period or calendar year, calendar period, your customers, your items, some groups of customers, groups of items, groups of general ledger accounts, warehouse that the transactions are coming from, vendors, vendor group. You can combine multiple data sources within a single cube. And you can slice and dice dynamically so that you can filter your data and control what you see. This is very useful to analyze your business performance, identify trends and exceptions. You can configure Info Explorer with personalized dashboards. There's a whole dimension of Info Explorer as part of the write-back license, which is focusing on budgeting and forecasting, where you can build your budget bottom-up, top-down with multiple spread methods and save your data back to your ERP system. We will not be looking at that in today's presentation. You can try Info Explorer with the Lite edition, which is a fully functional edition, free with no time limit, no commitment. You just need to give us your details and your server name. With that edition, you can use all the predefined sample cubes. You can connect it to your own data. You can customize the cubes, add some views, add some charts, add some dashboards, but you can't change the underlying query and you can't export the details to Excel. But it's ideal for customer demonstrations and trials. Because we find that when you actually use Info Explorer on your data, it is easier to see the power of the tool. We often compare Info Explorer to Excel pivot tables that many of you are familiar with. While we may not use the same labels to describe each component, the concepts between Info Explorer and pivot tables are very similar. For those of you familiar with pivot tables, what we're going to look at before we delve into Info Explorer is how they compare. And they're both data analysis tools that allow users to summarize and analyze large sets of data in an organized and structured format. Users can rearrange the raw data and present it in a more manageable and understandable way. The key components would be your rows and your columns. Users can select specific columns from their data to be used in the pivot table, and they become the primary axis to organize your data. In Info Explorer, we generally call this a dimension, and it can be your year, month, group of customers, item category. Pivot tables have values, and they're the data points that you want to analyze or summarize. They're typically numeric, and they are aggregated using functions like sum, average, count, rank. Often there'd be something like your sales, your cost, the transaction amount, your margin, or there can be a calculation and a formula. A value with an aggregation method becomes what we call a fact in Info Explorer that you can then show in your cube. Pivot tables often include filter that allow users to focus on specific subset of the data. The filters can be applied to limit the information that you see. For example, only show me some years, only show me some customers. You can also filter based on the actual values. So show me all the customers where the sales were greater than a particular amount. And you can do that in Info Explorer as well. In a pivot table, you have this drag and drop interface where users can easily rearrange and reorganize the structure of the table based on what they need to analyze. So you might start with sales by customer per year, choose to focus on 1 year, and then add the month because you want to delve into more details by month. And this is the same in Info Explorer. Dynamic updates. While pivot tables are dynamic, if you change the underlying data in your spreadsheet, you can refresh your pivot table. But generally, your spreadsheet isn't directly connected to your database. You have to run a report to export it out of your database, refresh the data in the spreadsheet, and then your pivot table will refresh. With Info Explorer, you can refresh the data by just connecting to the database and clicking a refresh button. And also, if you change what you're looking at, adding more details, all your aggregations, your minimum, your maximum, your average get recalculated based on the data you're looking at. If we're now looking at this in a pivot table, we've got our rows, our values, and our aggregation. We've got our filters, number 4. We can drag and drop the fields that we are showing in our table, and we can refresh our data. If I look at this in Info Explorer, similarly, I have in this example as rows, salesperson and customer group, fiscal year as my column. My values are net sales and margin, and while we're not showing it in the screenshot, they're configured as a sum, so that gives us our aggregation, and we will look at other examples of aggregation in the presentation. We've got our filters, so we're only showing the year 2020 to 2022. Our drag and drop interface, we've got our dimensions, customers, account set, etc., that we can drag into rows or columns to add or to replace the ones that we've got in our current views, and we've got the facts that we can add. Now that we've agreed on some terminology as to what to do with Info Explorer, let's look at this in action and see how we can explore and analyze our datasets without the need for advanced data manipulation skills. We're going to look at 2 order entry, 2 sales analysis cube, one in Sage 300 and one in Spire. We'll look at facts and dimensions, how we can drag them around, look at the menu to expand and collapse, see how we can view some more details, and we will then look at filtering and sorting records. Let's now look at the sales history cube, and we're going to look at this view that is very similar to the one we looked at in the PowerPoint presentation, where I currently have as rows salesperson and customer group, fiscal year as columns, and I'm showing 29-20, and I'm showing two facts, my net sales and my margin. You can see here in the available area that there are other dimensions. You can see there the label is in black, whereas facts, the label is in light blue. I can take one of these dimensions and add it here. And now I'm going to see more detail by category within my salesperson and my customer group. I can also add this fact called my margin percent. I'm dragging it around here to my displayed facts, and it's immediately adding a column. Now in our example, we've configured some conditional formatting, and we will look at how to do this in a little bit more detail a bit later. Now on this menu, we can see we can expand or collapse. I've now got a summary by salesperson, or if I want to see more detail about one particular salesperson, I can expand from here, one by one, depending on the results that I see. I want to expand on the one that have a bigger margin to see, which item categories are in there. Or I can expand all the rows and columns by clicking expand, and everything gets expanded. If I like this view and I want to keep the summary view as well, I can copy the view. Right click on a view, it's a little bit like a sheet in a spreadsheet. Copy it, rename it to something that is relevant. This is my summary view, so I'm going to collapse it. There is no maximum number of views as such. If you have too many views, it's getting it gets too cluttered, and it's much easier to use the fact that you can change this dynamically by using expand or collapse to do your analysis rather than have too many views. If I focus on bill basin sales and I want to know what this total is made up of, I can right click and choose drill down. What this does is show me the detailed transactions that make up this total. I can press Ctrl C to copy the contents to a clipboard and paste it in a spreadsheet or in an email if I'm responding to somebody's query. So this is a really good way to do some analysis on the fly. You may not always want to see that detail, so your report shows you the summary, but the detail is available when you need it. The level of detail that you can see is defined in the query that is behind the cube. If you are using Sage 300 and you're looking at a low level of transactions, so if I'm dragging item number here, you also have the ability to drill through, which will then open the underlying Sage 300 screen. In this case, I can drill through to the IC item. I could also drill through to the underlying customer or the underlying OE order, depending on how my cube is configured. And again, we have demonstrated this in various other presentations, so we won't show that to you today. We've reviewed the principles of slicing and dicing in a cube, and now Anne will take us through filtering and sorting data in Info Explorer.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm going to give you some tips on filtering and sorting using Info Explorer. For filtering, there are 3 different ways you can filter the data you're seeing, either by selecting a particular dimension value, or you can pre-filter the underlying records, or you can filter on a calculated fact. And for sorting, you can either sort your data by dimension value or by fact. Using this AP Purchases by GL account multi-company cube, Just to give you an overview of what data I have data across two companies, Orc Ltd and Orc Inc. 2, and I'm seeing my AP purchases by vendor, also by account code, and we have grouped the GL accounts into region and division where appropriate. So if I expand my Orc Limited, I can see the amounts posted to no division, to the commercial division and the retail division. And in Orc Inc. 2, similarly, I can see the amounts posted to no division, commercial division and retail division. In order to filter on a dimension, if the dimension only has a handful of values, like company and region, then you can just click on the filter icon on the top of the division, and let's just say we only want to see the amounts posted to commercial and retail, so we can say only for 100 and 200. And then perhaps for company, if we only wanted to show Orc Limited or Orc Inc. 2, we could select the individual company. So this is very useful when you only have a handful of entries in that particular dimension. Another one that's a good example for filtering by dimension value is fiscal year. So here, if we click on the fiscal year, we can see we're already filtering and we're only looking at 2021, 2022 and 2020. And if we wanted only 2023's data, we could select that way as well. But this sort of filtering is not so useful when you have longer dimension values. So let's just go back and look at all our companies, all our divisions and all our fiscal years. And now we can see if we want to filter on our vendor dimension, and depending on how many vendors you have, it's quite awkward finding the particular dimension value that you want. So the second way that you can filter by dimension value is using what we call a pre-filter. And a pre-filter allows you to filter the underlying records. So if I apply a pre-filter, and I can have a number of different and or conditions for the filter, but I could say vendor equals and then select the vendor this way. So now I'm saying I'm only going to see the information for vendor 1200, and this sort of pre-filter shows here. So we can select and deselect the pre-filter on the view itself. Or we could say, let's see, vendor equals 1200 and add multiple conditions where we can select by vendor or any of the other dimension values. And if you've got multiple conditions, you must say all must be true, at least one must be true. So whether you're doing an and or an or. So let's say at least one condition must be true. So we're going to say vendor equals 1200 or vendor equals 1400 or vendor equals 4540. And now we get the three vendors, and you can see the condition that is built up here, and can be turned on and off by selecting the tick box beside the filter condition on the particular view. So a pre-filter is happening on the underlying data records and not on a calculated field. If we were to filter on the amount excluding tax being greater than 15,000, for example, that would mean we are filtering for an individual record, an individual invoice coded to a GL account being greater than 15,000. So we would not see vendor 1200 maybe, we would only see vendors where an individual invoice was greater than 15,000. So let's just apply that filter, and you'll see there's only two vendors where an individual invoice line amount is greater than 15,000. And if we drill into those particular details, we will see the individual invoice. And the third type of filtering allows you to filter on a view on calculated values. So in this example, I'm looking at my total spend with vendors for the year 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. And if I wanted to show all those vendors with whom we had spent more than $10,000, we need to decide, is that $10,000 in total, or is it $10,000 in any one year? And to apply such a filter, you select this filter icon at the bottom of the dimension value. So I am going to be filtering all my vendors where, and I can add as many conditions as I want. So here, do I want to check, is the grand total greater than 10,000, or any one particular year is greater than 10,000, or any one fiscal year, or every fiscal year? So I'm going to do any one fiscal year where the amount excluding tax is greater than $10,000. So this is based on the totals that the cube has calculated and is currently displaying. So now I'm only seeing vendors where in any one year the greater is $10,000. So it doesn't qualify for this year or this year, but it does for 2023 and for 2020. Similarly, these vendors qualify in the year 2020, and this vendor qualifies in the year 2022. And the applied totals filter is shown along the bottom. We have looked at the three different ways to filter data on a cube: by selecting the dimension values, by pre-filtering the underlying records, and by filtering using the calculated fact values. Now we're going to look at sorting. We can sort either by dimension value or by fact. To look at the sorting, we're still looking at our AP purchases by GL account across two companies, but this time I'm looking at my purchase GL account as my rows and my fiscal year as my columns. To sort by dimension value, you can select this arrow on the dimension name. So you can only sort by the visible dimensions. So if I click on this arrow, it's going to sort my purchase GL account descending or ascending based on the visible accounts. And I can also sort my years ascending as it currently is, or descending. So now 2023 is the first year going back to 2020. So for your visible dimensions, you click on the arrow to change the sort method. And to sort by dimension value, I could either sort my purchase accounts by dimension value in 2020, 2021, etc., or I could do it by total. So if I want to sort my purchase GL account by the total amount of the spend, I can right-hand mouse button on the column header and say sort purchase GL account by this column. And initially it will sort it ascending. So these are my GL accounts ascending by value in total. And if I change my filter on the purchase account now, it's now going to be showing me sorted in total but descending. So my largest account is 6561-2, rent for the warehouse. We have seen how to filter and sort our data. And as a reminder, you can find this information in our online help.
Next, we're going to look at formatting a cube, display options, adding some styles, doing some conditional formatting, and then we will look at using dashboards in the cube. I'm now looking at sales history based on sparse sample data with user-defined fields, which is available as a sample cube on the Info Explorer website. Very similar to what we looked at before, I've got my salesperson, my customer, and my invoice year and month. So similarly, I can expand or collapse everything. I have a pre-filter like we have just seen, which I can turn on or off. So I'm going to leave all the filters off so I can see various data, and we can now see different formatting. So my margin, some of my margin percent are in yellow and some of my percent change are in red. So let's have a look at Info Explorer to see how we did that. And basically you have to do two main things. First is to create some styles. So here we've got one called yellow, red and green based on the background color. So you can create a new style, call it blue. I could change the font, change the text color, or change the background color, and I'm going to choose the light blue similar to Orchid's color. Save that. And then I can apply these rules overall to a cube. So we can see that, for example, for total, I'm using a style called totals that apply to all the totals. My default applies to normal cells. And I've also got one that is used in the context of budgeting, where I'm applying a particular style to cells with amending work set data. So I can create a new rule that will apply across the board, and either if a value is less than or use a range, use a particular style. So I could say if the value is less than 100,000, apply the blue style. I then need to move this style to be the first one that's applied. So, and then I've got my usual total. So I'm going to say greater than 100,000 for total cells in blue. I'm going to create a new rule which is greater than 10,000. That applies only to normal cells, and I'm also going to use the blue. And this rule, I'm also going to move it up so that it overrides my default values. I'm going to save this, close, and now I can see that numbers, normal cells, greater than 10,000 are in blue, and others don't have any background color. So these are for general rules, but most likely the kind of rules we're going to do is more around conditional formatting that apply to a particular field. And to do this, we're going to edit the field. So if I find here my base margin percent and check the styles, I can see that between 20 and 50%, I'm going to make it yellow. Less than 20, it's not a very good margin, it's red. And over 50 is a good margin, it's green. So a reminder that you first create your style, yellow, red and green, and then you apply the style to the particular field that you want to use. We've also got one that is applied to our formula here, our margin percent change. And we're saying if the margin is less than 0, make it red. And again, that applies to both normal cells, so a value that comes from the query, and total cells, a value that is calculated in the cube. So if I save that, this is what we're seeing here. But I might find, okay, there is too much yellow for this base margin percent. So I'm going to say anything that is less than 30% should actually be red. So I'm going to edit my field, my base margin percent formula, edit the styles here, and change the rules so that if it's between 30 and 50, it's going to be yellow. But if it is less than 30, it's going to be red. So I'm going to save this. And now you can see that this margin, which is 23, less than 30, is now red. This one is 25, less than 30, it's now red. So to see detailed steps about this again, you can go to the Info Explorer website under Resources, Online Help. I can open the Info Explorer Online Help and look for conditional formatting here and look at the details under Format a Cube. It's going to show me the example that we've looked at with green, red and orange and applying the rules. If you have a style that is not in use, a little tip is that you can just hit the delete key on the keyboard to delete the selected style from the cube. And if it is used, you're not allowed to delete it. And now over to Anne to present dashboards.
You can have multiple dashboards, each with multiple views and graphs. And per dashboard, you can change the fields that are displayed in the dashboard view. You can change the dashboard size and the number of views that are included. You can add or swap views and charts onto the dashboard. You can use pre-filters on the views, and you can use filters on calculated facts. Using our existing AP Purchases by GL account multi-company cube, we can see we already have one dashboard, which is currently showing us two graphs and two views of different sizes. On an existing dashboard, if you wanted to change the display, you could right-hand mouse button and show the available fields. If you want to change what your rows or columns are, you could show the columns or the row area and hide the tree. So if we show the row area, we now see the distribution code, and we can sort by distribution code, we can filter by distribution code, or change our rows and columns. We could also, if we wanted a different view, we could close this particular view and drag on another view. And if that view had a filter, a pre-filter, you can select and deselect it on the view as well. And you can change the size of your views. So instead of making it 1 by 1, we could make it wider to fill this gap. And now we could turn on our distribution codes that do not start with O. So now we'll see all of the ones that don't start with O are hidden, and now we'll see all our distribution codes. To create a new dashboard, you select New Dashboard. You can rename it. And by default, it has 3 rows and 3 columns. And now you can just drag any of your charts or views onto the dashboard. But if we wanted this one to be long and thin, we could right-hand mouse button, change the size, and make it 3 down. And then when we drag our another chart perhaps onto the top here, we could make this one too wide. Maybe we need to do a bit more depth as well. And drag our final view that we want to see onto the bottom. On an existing dashboard, you can change the row and columns by showing the column area and then selecting different columns, or showing the row area, selecting different values, or even showing the available fields and dragging them down as your row or column. You can change the size of your individual views on the dashboard, and if your dashboard has got a pre-filter or a values filter, it can still be selected on and off at the time in the dashboard.
In the next part of the presentation, we're going to look at updating the underlying query in the cube and adding calculated fields in Info Explorer Cube. All Info Explorer cubes are connecting to the database directly through SQL or through ODBC. In many cases, you can use an inbuilt graphical tool within Info Explorer called Query Builder, where you can add fields to the query or add tables to your query. You can also add calculated fields in the cube, for example, a rank or a percentage of column or percentage. Some fields are better suited to be added to the query, and generally it's faster, but some calculations like a percentage or a rank that is relative to the data you're looking at is better to be added directly in the cube. If we come back to our sales history cube, we currently have salesperson, customer group, category, customer number, etc., I might want to add the location to this cube or the warehouse. And for this, I can use Query Builder, which opens a graphical interface, a representation of the database that I have in my cube. So here I can see various tables that I have, and you can use the object model that is generally available for all your ERP application, sales history, and I might want to add the location or the warehouse. So just select it in here. We'll change the query that I'm viewing here. I can click on data to see what it's showing me, and then go File, OK, click Refresh. This will connect to my database, and now I have one more dimension available, which is my inventory location, which I can then drag into my view here and back to collapsing, and now I have my sales by warehouse. Similarly with my Spy cube, unfortunately right now I don't have, this cube is not connected directly to my database. This is the data that I have retrieved last time I refreshed it. But if I want to see the query that is behind this cube, I can go to Properties and look at the cube here, and this is the query that we're running. So I could copy Control A and Control C to copy this, and if I can't use Query Builder, then I can paste this into the tool that I normally use to work out my queries, adjust the query, and paste it back into the properties of the cube.
The next feature we're going to look at in Info Explorer is adding facts and formulas. So this enables you to add your own calculations in the cube. Firstly, you can change the aggregation method of a fact in the cube. So a fact is a number that is being returned by the SQL query. By default, your facts will be summed, but you can calculate the number of records in that fact, the minimum value, the maximum value, the average value, and a ranking. For example, your top 10 vendors or top 10 customers, top 10 items. You can also add a formula. So, for example, sales minus cost of sales equals margin. And you can display a sum as a percent variation across by your columns or by your rows, or a percentage of the total of the row or the column. For example, this vendor is 10% of the total purchases that month. And I'm going to show you some examples to calculate the top 10 vendors, and also a percentage of the total and a margin percent. In this cube, I'm looking at my AP purchases by GL account across multiple companies, Orc Limited and Orc Inc. 2. And I'm currently looking at all my vendors, the total spend, the amount excluding tax, the tax amount, and the amount including tax. And if I go to the fields, I can see that the amount excluding tax, the tax amount, and the amount including tax is the sum of my field in the underlying table that I have extracted from my Sage 300 company database. So the field name is amount including tax. This is the caption. It is a fact, and we're currently looking at the sum of it, and it's summing the field amount including tax and displaying it in its default calculation. And that is the same for the amount excluding tax, tax amount, and amount including tax. So let me just simplify this view. So I'm getting rid of these two facts and putting them up in the available area as opposed to in the displayed area. So now I'm looking at my spend per company, per vendor, amount excluding tax. If I wanted to do a calculation on this amount excluding tax, I can click Create a New Fact. Give it a name. So I'm going to calculate the rank of my vendor's amount excluding tax. So instead of it being a sum, I'm going to make it a descending rank of my amount excluding tax. So these fields showing here are the raw data or the columns that have come in from the SQL query. And I'm going to display it as default. When I save that, you will see I now have my rank included. So it's ranking my vendors within Orc Limited, within Orc Inc. 2, and in total. And now I can use my sorting. So if I want to see my descended rank across all the companies, I can see that 7400 is my largest vendor, but in Orc Inc. 2 it's 17, and in Orc Limited it's number 1. So your ranking or your calculations on top of the data is always with respect to the data that you're currently looking at. So if I was to associate, or if I was to group my vendors by group code, you can see it's now ranking my vendor within the group and then ranking the group within the total. So in a grouping for inventory where I have a handful of vendors, you can see it's ranking them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm still sorting based on the total. And my inventory group is the biggest within the total of all the groups. So the formulas you add are calculated and displayed relative to the data that you're currently viewing. I'm now ranking my vendor within the group code and the vendor group code within the company. And if I remove the group code, I'm ranking my vendor just within company. So just having a look at that rank again. In a similar way, we could add a calculation to show us the sum of the records, the number of records that make up that total, the distinct count, for example, of an invoice number to see how many invoices a vendor has, the minimum value, the maximum value, average value, ascending or descending rank, and calculate a formula itself. I'll show you the formula later. But we're going to add a new fact. This time it's going to be the percentage of column. It's going to be a fact, a sum of our amount excluding tax, and we're going to show this as a percent of the column value. So you can see this 7400 vendor, 87,000, is 41% of the total, 11% of the total, all the way down to 0.08% of the total. And this is for Orc Limited. Here, this 35,000 for chloride systems is 26% of the total. And if we look at the total of the two companies, we can see that 7400 is 25% of the total. So you can either add a percent of your column values, or depending on your display, you could add a percent of your row values. And here is another example of our percent of total. This time we're looking at our item and customer sales, and we've grouped our items by category, and we can see that the accessories is 96% of the total, the packaging is 3.88% of the total. Let's just filter on 2022 as it has better data. And we can see accessories is 8%, packaging is 7%, and executive desk chairs is 32%. So in the same way as we saw our vendors percent of the total, we're now seeing our item categories as the percentage of the total. And if we take our item number from the available area to the displayed area and make it a row, we can now see our percent of total of the item within the category. So 61% within accessories, 2% within accessories, as well as the accessories as a percent of the total. And in the same way, the percent of total was added on the net sales column. And here we can have a look at the margin percent formula. So margin percent is calculated in the cube, and it is shown as a formula, and it's saying if net sales value, so the net sales dot value is equal to 0, make the calculation 0, otherwise it's the margin dot value divided by the net sales dot value times by 100. And the totals are not summed, they are re-evaluated. So when you add a formula such as this, if we look at our margin percent, and let's just get rid of percentage of total to keep our view simple. So our margin percent is 60, 53, 58, and so on. But we can also recalculate the margin percent at a category level. So this is not the sum of these margin percents, but it's recalculated because on the field we said that the margin percent, the totals are re-evaluated. So if you don't say evaluated, then the totals would be summed up and you would just get a sum of all the margin percents in this total. We've had a look at ranking vendors, showing vendors as a percent of the total, and how to calculate margin percent. And just as a reminder, in our knowledge base we have a number of examples on adding formulas and working with different types of facts in Info Explorer cubes.
Optional fields in Sage 300, user-defined fields in Spire, because they are configurable in your own database, are a little bit more tricky to set up than just ticking a box in Query Builder. The Spire user-defined fields, the best starting point is to use the documentation of using user-defined field in Crystal Reports, and we'll look at how this was done in the sample cube that we have. With Sage 300, optional fields can be added by adding the table and doing the filters, but we also have a module called Data Views, which creates a SQL view that basically transforms your optional field into a column in your query, and you can then add that to your cube as you would add any other field. There is a presentation of that on the website. I would encourage you to look at data views if you're using Info Explorer and optional fields. Looking at our sales history with user-defined field cube, if I look at the properties and look at the cube, this is basically the SQL query that is behind the cube. You could see the different user-defined fields that we are returning here. Some are set up as a no, yes, a field. It's the values that we are returning. And this is documented here as per the Spire documentation and an example here. We're now looking at how we can refresh cubes. You can manually click refresh, and that will go back to the database and read the data as of now. There are two auto refresh configuration options in Info Explorer. One is to auto refresh when you open the cube, and the other one is while you're using the cube, you can choose to refresh regularly every X number of minutes. You can also use Process Scheduler Level 1 to distribute the cubes, so to refresh them and email them to users. So we'll look at these options in Info Explorer just now. So here I'm looking at my AR outstanding balances cube. If I go to the Properties tab and look at my query, the data that is being retrieved from Sage 300, I can tick this box that says refresh automatically on open. So you'll make sure whenever you open the cube, you have the latest data. And this is a good idea if appropriate and if your query doesn't take too long. So you may not want to be refreshing that while users are entering transaction, if you've got a really large sales history cube, for example. Then on the auto refresh tab, I have the ability to say, let's refresh every 10 minutes. And if you have a simple cube that is looking at, let's say, orders for today or the list of back orders, and you want to display that on a dashboard that you look at all the time, then this is a really great option. Next, we're going to look at security tips when using Info Explorer to make sure your data is safe. Under Properties, there are 6 options where you can lock what people can do with a cube. First, if you want the ability to password protect the entire file, you use log file. So a user would need the password to actually open the cube. The cube connects to your database through the connection details. So if you have multiple databases and certain users only view certain databases, you can lock the connection so that they can't change the connection details. You can also lock an individual cube within the file, and that's particularly relevant if you have different queries and different cubes within a single CUBX Info Explorer cube file. And when you do this, it means you need to enter the password before viewing or amending the underlying query. We've just looked at how to refresh the cube. If you don't want users to refresh all the time during business hours, you can lock the refresh and only have a few users with the password who can refresh manually. If you use write back, you can use lock write back to lock the ability to update the budget in the work sets, and write back query, lock write back query to require password before you can update the budget in Sage 300. So let's have a look at this quickly in Info Explorer. So here on Properties, these are the different options that we've looked at. You can put a password here. I need to enter the password twice, but remember there is no way to retrieve the password. So if you enter a password, make sure that you save a master copy of your cube without a password somewhere safe for the power user in case something happens and people can't remember the password. And it's the same for all the lock options. You enter your 2 passwords in there. So I'm going to say lock refresh. Say OK, and now if I click refresh, I need to enter the password. If I put the password wrong, getting invalid password. Try again. Put in the right password, and it's now refreshing. So a common question is, where do I find the fields that I want to report on? And generally the best starting point for your database is the application object model. Most databases have an application object model. There is one for Orchid modules for Sage 300 on the Orchid website. A lot of the points that we've looked at today are available in the Info Explorer help. I will just point out to one particular one around the SPI ODBC connection. So this is a support question, Info Explorer for SPI being fairly new in the channel. And we have the detailed steps in here to install your 64-bit PostgreSQL ODBC driver, set up the connection, looking at the details in the spy.ini file, and in most cases you need to use the Unicode ODBC driver. All the details are here, so I'd encourage you to refer to the help. Licensing tips, again, they're available on the Info Explorer website. We have discussed the light version, which lets you run on the demo cubes. You can't change the underlying query, but you can obviously point it to your own database. It's a great way to get started with Info Explorer. Standard license gives you, in addition to the ability to use the cube, the ability to change the query, to add more fields, and to export to CSV or Excel. The write-back license is for budgeting purposes, where you can use work sets to store your budget and, if necessary, push them back into your ERP database. There are a lot of presentations on the Info Explorer website around write-back by project or by customer and item budgets. In the Sage 300 world, we have a few modules that work very well with Info Explorer. Optional tables to track budget at a level that is not available in Sage 300. Data views we've mentioned, and process scheduler to refresh the cubes automatically. Again, I'll encourage you to have a look at the website for more details. Thank you very much for your time, and we are now open for questions.